Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, where we aim to get the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. I'm Todd Landman. In this series, the Rights Track is on the road, capturing the voices, experiences, and knowledge of people around the world who are part of the global coalition to end modern slavery by 2030. In today's episode, we are discussing what helps victims of slavery stay free after they've been freed. My guest is Juliana Semione. Juliana is a researcher at the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab, who's working to reduce the likelihood of slavery survivors going back into slavery by better understanding what can help them be resilient and the support they need from practitioners and policymakers. She's been researching the concept of freedom from slavery across survivors, law enforcement officials, and providers of care in the United States and the United Kingdom. So welcome, Juliana. It's nice to have you here on this episode of the Rights Track.
Thanks for inviting me on the show.
So maybe you could start telling me a little bit about your research. You are researching, broadly speaking, the concept of freedom, and this is not an uncontroversial topic or an uncontroversial word itself. So tell me a little bit about what got you into thinking about this notion of freedom.
Sure. I had a lot of other research questions that I wanted to ask, and they were all sort of surrounding the topic of how do we keep survivors free? What are those secret ingredients, if you will, to sustain freedom? And as I tried to delve down those topics and I tried to build projects around each question, I realized I can't ask those questions if I don't have an understanding of freedom, because freedom's at the core of all the questions I wanted to ask. So I took a step back and asked, all right, what is freedom? And that's how we started that process.
And where did you find your answer to what is freedom?
I've collected the data, which means I've worked with, as you said, 3 different cohorts of people who are affected by modern slavery. And essentially, they are the primary source on freedom. I wanted to look historically in the literature. I wanted to look back and see what people have already said about freedom. But there isn't a definition about freedom from modern slavery, freedom from slavery today. So I wanted to go to the primary sources of people who are actually affected by this question and who it turns out would love an answer just as much as I would.
So it's grounded, at least in the philosophy and conceptions of freedom, but then it's given its reality, if you will, or a grounding in the lived experiences of people who've been affected by modern slavery. But not only those that were trapped in the condition of modern slavery, but also those responsible for helping people. So tell me a little bit about maybe some of the differences you perceive in those 3 communities.
Sure, great question. One of the reasons I've included those 3 different communities to begin with is that people who are responsible for sort of actuating freedom in the lives of survivors, either through services they provide or through the legislation and the enforcement of different laws and policies, those people are affected by modern slavery and have a vested interest in seeing freedom come about in a sustainable way for people. And so that's part of why I started with looking at 3 cohorts instead of only looking and asking survivors what they think freedom is. And there's actually been quite a lot of overlap, partly I presume because these cohorts actually interact with one another. So even if my specific participants don't know one another, they do know people from those other cohorts as a regular part of their life. And so some of the differences that I'm seeing really come down more to not so much disagreements over certain concepts of freedom, but different prioritizations of those concepts. So broadly speaking, my participants were presented with a series of statements about freedom, possible concepts to interact with. And it was very rare that an entire group of people would disagree as a blanket statement with any concept. They just prioritized it differently than other cohorts did. A lot of similarities have cropped up. One of those biggest similarities is that one of the statements or one of the concepts of freedom was drawn out of legislation that the US and the UK at least share in language. And that's the concept of being free from coercion, having free will to do as you wish without being forced, pressured, coerced to act in a certain way. And that statement really rose to the top almost as a statement of fact. People almost took that as factually that's correct. How could I disagree with it? And it kind of tapered off from there in terms of priorities around different concepts.
Feels like from what you're saying, this falls into this idea of freedom from rather than freedom to. So were they more focused on the idea of freedom from things? You talked about freedom from coercion, or is there something lurking in their responses around freedom to do things, that this notion of agency is not only about not having people do terrible things to you or constrain your agency, but also that when free, you are free to choose to do whatever you like to do, obviously without harming others, the sort of standard liberal conception of freedom. So did you get that sense of that difference, or are they just grabbing it all?
There is a distinction, and to be honest, they're actually looking at freedom more as freedom too. It was just that one statement that rose to the top really consistently. It's not 100%, you can't make blanket statements almost ever like that, but almost every time that statement rose to the very top because people considered it factual, as I said, but when they looked at what else was important to them, they actually put freedom from much lower in their prioritized list. And sometimes they disagreed with statements about freedom from this or that thing. For example, the statements that consistently rose to the top below that free will, that freedom from coercion, things that floated to the top just beneath that were things like having the ability to defend yourself against those who would try to limit your free will. So it's this freedom to defend yourself. It's a capability and it's a freedom to defend yourself. There was also a statement that talked about how freedom is the process of adjusting to no longer being enslaved. And that was, I suppose, I would interpret that statement as almost a mixture of freedom from slavery transitioning into freedom to a life without it. But that was, by participants, really viewed that as a positive statement. They didn't think of that so much as freedom from something, despite what interpretation I might bring to it. And then finally, the really significant statement, especially for survivors, was being healed from trafficking or modern slavery and the damaging effects that it had on you. And so, again, I think that's a statement that we could look at as a freedom from statement. But when I talked to participants in interview settings, they really felt like that was more of a statement toward empowerment and toward a full sort of realization of life.
And that's a really important point. We just said that last one, because I think when we read the popular press and some of the commentary on this, it's certainly in the context of the United Kingdom, when people are referred into the national referral mechanism, they have 45 days of treatment, which now legally has been challenged, that somehow the event is over. And what you're suggesting is that there is a prolonged sense of impact. Some might use the word trauma. But equally, there's been this terrible event that's happened to someone, and just because they are free from the coercion that they've experienced doesn't mean that they are necessarily free, because they're still haunted by those memories, or they're nervous and worried about falling back into that situation. So you get that sense of foreboding. And did you get any sense of the time frame it takes for this empowerment to be engendered?
Not so much. I got a sense for what time it doesn't take for that to be engendered,
Right.
because similarly to how I've just described several statements that were consistently highly ranked for you, there are also a couple statements that were very consistently very lowly ranked. And so one of those statements was, you achieve freedom the moment you're physically removed from your trafficker.
Right.
Almost everybody disagreed. This is just not true. And in the interview, it would come out that nobody from any of those groups of people I worked with had a solid answer to how long freedom takes, because it's very subjective and individualized,
Sure.
but it certainly isn't going to happen in a moment. And it isn't something that you can tick off a list. It's more of something that you grow into or that grows.
And it would be different for each person.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's get to the method. First of all, you selected the United Kingdom and you selected the United States. What was the decision behind using those two countries?
Part of my reason for that was that both of those countries have some shared principles in their legislation around modern slavery. They definitely have a shared self-made identity about being leaders in the fight against modern slavery. And those countries both had sort of a public discourse going on around modern slavery, sometimes as a result of their legislation and sometimes as a result of how they see themselves in the policy world. But that meant that for the purpose of my method, there was a lot of public discourse to draw, and that was a significant part of starting this study, was just understanding people aren't defining freedom, but they are talking about it. How are they talking about it? And there's a lot of material for that in those two countries.
And did you find any difficulty in getting access to the three pillars of different respondent groups, or did you have reasonably good access?
That really varied and in ways that surprised me. People were really receptive to being a part of the study. And again, blanket statements never work. So almost everyone who participated said it was a really enjoyable and rewarding experience. They actually were very engaged even at the end of our research sessions. But there were times when practicalities got in the way. So if you're working with law enforcement or you're working with service providers, their jobs have to come first. And so they'll sometimes have to tend to things that weren't scheduled or tend to things that cropped up and needed them to step away for the day. I did tend to try and stay in a city for about 3 weeks on average, and I worked in a total of 7 different cities. So I tried to be able to mitigate that and reschedule with people. One of the more difficult groups of people to contact was survivors, and understandably so. You can't just walk into a coffee shop and announce that you're looking for survivors of modern slavery. You certainly couldn't walk into a safe house, even if you knew where one was, and sort of ask for people to volunteer without having met you and having no rapport. And so those referrals often came word of mouth through service providers. And even though those service providers themselves were not necessarily participating, I was often very dependent on people to connect me with survivors. And then once I built that trust in a community, it was easier for people to keep referring me and connecting me to other participants.
And of course, you get consent and you promise anonymity. All the sort of standard
Absolutely.
protocols are in place. Good. So talk me through the methodology, because you use what's called Q methodology, which is something that's been used in public policy analysis. It's very popular in policy analysis programs and public policy programs. But you've used that methodology in a particular way to address this question of freedom. So talk me through the steps that you took to use this method and how did it work?
Sure. So Q method is really based in the idea of a science of subjectivity. So the idea that we want to be able to measure how people think, how they communicate on a subconscious and conscious level, but this subjectivity that we use as a means of communication, how do we measure it? How do we name it? How do we make observations about humanity based on it? So the first step in any Q study is the concourse, and that's where the researcher is going to look at all the things that could be said about their topic. And they're going to build a concourse which really has no outer limit. It could be a very, very large set of possible concepts. And almost everything is fair game. So it doesn't have to be just spoken or written word. It could be images, it could be movies, it could be songs, it could be any variety of ways that people communicate ideas about the topic. In my case, the topic of freedom. So if your topic was something else, you'd look at how people talk about your own topic. So my concourse consisted ultimately of about 700 statements. I did look at things that were not text-based and not words-based. I converted those to some form of statement so that I could then have everything on sort of an equal playing field and filter through it to continue the steps of my methodology. The next step is building what's called the Q sample. And that's the deck of cards or a deck of statements that participants are going to look at. And so that's actually a really critical piece of the process, because everything that you do moving forward is going to be based on that Q sample. Conversation you and I are having is based on that Q sample. So I reduced that concourse down to 49 representative statements.
From 700?
From over 700 statements,
right.
Yes.
So talk me through that process, because there'll be a lot of people interested in how one does this.
Yes. I'm actually working on writing a piece to describe in greater detail how that worked, because there aren't a lot of pieces about that. Q researchers don't talk about their concourse often. But the way I reduced that down was by saying, first, I decided I'm not going to structure this. There wasn't really a working theory of freedom. In some Q studies, there's a working framework or a working theory that can be applied to help structure how these statements come out. And there isn't really one for freedom from modern slavery, not that kind of freedom in particular. So I didn't want to force a framework on it. So I went through a very long series of starting over, moments of starting over and moments of reshuffling my cards, literally reshuffling these 700 cards. And ultimately, I was trying to find patterns. I was trying to find what categories or themes emerged. And at the end of the day, long story short, about 49 different themes emerged about how people talk about freedom specifically from modern slavery.
So there was some duplication, and you were able to deduplicate down to the 49, and you feel that these are sort of the core sets of meetings. So it was quite an inductive process. You start with this huge concourse, 700 statements, but you start to see that there are similarities, and those themes then get organized down to, and you feel safe with the 49 that you ended up with.
I do. And I had to make some decisions, like I had to refine my question even further. The question that I ask participants is still, what is freedom from modern slavery? But in limiting what kinds of answers they could give me by limiting what kinds of statements were on the cards, I was making some decisions that precluded certain answers. So there was a whole category of ways that people talk about freedom that includes, it focuses very much on where freedom comes from, what the origins of freedom are. And instead of including the variety of possible origins of freedom in my Q sample, I instead opted to just add a question to the interview that follows a Q sample or a Q sort exercise. And I decided to just ask people, where do you think freedom comes from? Because in my mind, I had to decide, am I going to want to spend some of that valuable space with that deck of cards having people answer the question where freedom comes from instead of directly answering what it is? there were things like that ended up getting edged out, but they're still on record in my set of Concourse statements to refer back to.
But that step is both theoretically and philosophically justified because you're only interested in your topic, and therefore you're able to just, it's like Occam's razor. You're trying to shave away and shave away until you get down to that core set. So once you have your 49 statements, then what do you do with them?
It's worth saying that Q studies could be any different size of a Q sample. So I had 49. Other Q researchers have different size samples as well. So essentially what I did was I hit the road with my deck of cards. I had them printed out on little laminated business card sizes so that we could work with them easily and I could travel with them easily. I printed out a mat that was slightly smaller than A0, and it has a big grid on it with 49 boxes. Those boxes are organized in columns, and the outer columns are short, and the middle columns are the longest, so it's sort of an upside-down pyramid almost, made out of boxes. And participants were asked to begin with, could you just read this deck of cards so that you know what's in there? It's a big deck if you're not used to participating in research like this. And I said, can you just read these, familiarize yourself, and then we're going to start sorting them. So participants started with the column on the far right-hand side of the mat, and that column was just labeled agree. So I just started by asking, can you pick the 2 statements that you agree with the most out of this set? And they would put them out around that column. And then we jump all the way to the opposite side of the column, and I asked them, why this far left-hand side is labeled disagree. Can you give me the 2 statements you disagree with the most? And then we would alternate with the remaining columns. A few more cards for agree, a few more for disagree, a few more for agree, until we're in the middle. And that actually is the raw data of Q. That is the snapshot of someone's subjective perspective on my topic, freedom from modern slavery.
So there's a certain weighting in terms of most agree and most disagree. So it sounds like a survey question methodology, but the structure of the mat, you said an upside down pyramid. I think of an upside down normal distribution, right? And that's what it feels like, because you're getting the more ambiguous phrases kind of in the middle, whereas you have the more extreme phrases, or at least that which people thought they most agreed or disagreed with, sit on the outer bounds of that. So then you get this distribution. Do you do anything with assigning scores to where people put those cards?
Yes. So the scores are not printed on the mat, but each column is assigned a score. So when I record the data, the placement of each statement, when I record each statement's placement on that grid is assigned a score. So the far left-hand side column in my particular study was scored -5. The far right-hand side was scored +5. The dead middle column was 0. You can piece together what the rest were. And essentially, each column varies in size. It has a corresponding column on the opposite side of the map, but each positive column is a different length than the other positive columns, I should say. And so ultimately, you spend a little bit of time in a Q study doing a little bit of statistical work, and there's Q study packages put together particularly for this because Q differs from R in some significant ways. There's some significant assumptions that are different, but essentially it's factor analysis that comes out of it. So you turn your statements into numbers for the sake of the software. Statement number 1, I forget what that was. I haven't memorized them all, but each statement has a number. And then at the end of the factor analysis, you've still got your numbers intact. And so you can look and see, I've given you the sort of beginning of this podcast a couple examples of statements that ranked very highly, very frequently.
Right.
Just easy conversion back to what number 3 was or number 4 was.
So you get frequency counts then, and you get also location counts, because you know whether that's a most agree or most disagree. So you get the weighting as well as the frequency, and that gives you a sense of where the commonality of subjectivities are. And by having that scale, you are measuring subjectivity because the person is able to locate the card where they think it ought to be located. So it's a constrained choice, but there's still a lot of, if I may say, freedom within that choice to place those cards on the mat.
That's right. Yes.
Okay.
And preliminarily, there are a couple different patterns or factors emerging. I haven't finished the analysis, so I can't give you the full briefing on what this is going to say at the end of the day. But a couple preliminary patterns that are coming out of it. Some people distinctively think about freedom, and there's a set of subjective snapshots here where the Q sorts overlap on ideas about freedom as something that we rely on others for. It's dependent on others in society, or at least dependent on structures to enable us to have certain elements of freedom. And then another grouping that's emerging is a set of Q sorts that overlap significantly where they've actually placed a high value on statements that are not dependent on others. things that you can sort of work through internally, or you can work through internally with just the very slightest prompting from an outside support source. And so those are two sort of early patterns that are emerging.
So 3 groups of respondents in each country. How many respondents overall have you spoken to?
73.
73 altogether,
altogether.
Roughly split between the 2 countries.
Roughly. There was a bit more in the US than there were in the UK.
And about 10 per group then, per country.
I'd like to say that was what happened. That was the plan, but it didn't work out that way. At the end of the day, roughly half of my whole set of participants is service providers. And that pattern holds true for both countries. About half in each country turned out to be service providers. That was just something that happened in terms of the availability of participants. That also happened, I hypothesize that happened partly because there are more service providers in the anti-slavery world than there are law enforcement officers or survivors who we are in contact with or know about. And so in any given city, there's more service providers than any of the other cohorts. And I think that was something that emerged out of the study.
So you have all the data, you're still analyzing it, but when you analyze it and write it all up, what do you hope that this will achieve?
My biggest hope is really that it starts a conversation in the anti-slavery world, a conversation that we're only having unintentionally right now about freedom. I want us to ask what freedom is, and I want us to answer that question. So I want to be able to sort of offer up these patterns of thinking, these, patterns of subjectivity that come out and say, this wasn't just an interesting thought project. This is actually what we are thinking right now in the field. And here's almost holding it up as a mirror and saying, do we like what we see or do we not like what we see? And let's talk about it. In terms of actually making changes on the ground, I see 2 main audiences for this. Policymakers, I believe, don't give a lot of thought to what freedom means because primarily their responsibilities are to either prevent bad things happening or to mitigate the effects of bad things that have happened and respond to them by providing services and different facilitating prosecutions and things like that. I think we need to think about freedom. If we're really going to end slavery in our lifetimes, we can't just be freeing people into a big gray area where we have no certainty around what it is. How can we guide people toward a light if we can't see where the light is? And I think that it's important to me that on a larger level, on a national scale, we are actually asking, what does legislation direct us toward? And we have to be asking questions about what are we free to? What are survivors free to? And how do we build the steps to get them there? Service providers, talking to them as participants, I see that the possibility for applications of this is even broader than I had hoped, which is wonderful. Service providers often want to know as soon as we're done having a conversation about Q, maybe they've just put their last card down on the mat and they want to say, great, so how do I change my service provision? I said, well, let me get back to you on that. Give me just a little while. I'll get back to you on what the group at large here is saying in the world. But I would love to see service provision more efficient and to some degree more excellent than it's able to be without a definition. And I think it's the place of academia to have the space to ask these questions and then deliver those answers back to people who are on the ground, serving the survivors who are also on the ground, who are interacting with the law enforcement and supporting in prosecutions. And, the cycle kind of goes on. And I think it's kind of our luxury, if you will, to step in and say, I've got the time to do this study. I have the resources to do this. Like, let me help answer a question so that you can work more efficiently and more excellently towards your goal of freedom.
I think this is great. And, the whole thing around scholarly endeavor, challenging assumptions, you've come up with a systematic way of even exploring assumptions, of measuring and categorizing a quite subjective conception among those 3 communities, all with a goal to bring about positive change. And also just sometimes when laws are written or enforcement is provided or services are provided, it's done without that deep reflection and thinking about the concept itself. And finally, we hear a lot in the anti-slavery movement about survivor voice, and you've actually operationalized survivor voice in a really interesting way, which should give us insights into how laws are written, how services provided, and also how people are helped through this process of transition. So for now, it's just fantastic to have you here as a guest on the Rights Track. It just gives me the opportunity now to say thank you very much, Juliana, for joining us for this episode.
Thanks for having me on the show, Todd.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Rights Track, which was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Chris Garrington of Research Podcasts. You can find out more about our podcast at www.rightstrack.org. Funding for this series comes from the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab project, home to the world's leading contemporary modern slavery experts and first large-scale research platform for ending modern slavery.